Okay, we have with us today Granville Burgess, and he's going to be speaking about good old Shoeless Joe Jackson. And Granville is a playwright, a lyricist, novelist, director, actor, producer, and teacher. His plays, musicals, and teleplays have been produced nationwide and on network and cable TV, and he was an Emmy nominee. He has received numerous grants, including the National Endowment for the Humanities. He is the author of 2 screenplays, a novel about Shoeless Jackson, and a children's book. He has produced, directed, or acted in over 50 musicals and plays. Granville is a co-founder and CEO of Quill Entertainment Company, a nonprofit dedicated to creating and producing original history musicals. He is a graduate of the Phillips Exeter Academy, Princeton University, magna cum laude, and the Catholic University of America, Masters in Fine Arts, and has taught acting, directing, playwriting, and screenwriting at numerous schools and theaters. Born in, one of my favorite towns, Greenville, South Carolina, Granville lives now in Greenwich with Reva Beeson, his Amish Mennonite wife, and they have 4 children, Emily, Loring, Morgan, and Clara. His awards, an Emmy nomination for Outstanding Achievement TV serial for the soap opera Capital, the Pennsylvania Council on the Arts Playwriting Fellowship, a winner of the Center for Southern Studies Playwriting Competition, a runner-up Children's Theater of Palo Alto for New Play Contest. He's also received numerous grants from various organizations. So without further ado, I give you Granville Burgess. Granville, the floor is.
Okay, hi everybody. Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to talk about Shoeless Joe and baseball and life in the Carolina Mill Village, especially here now that the baseball playoffs are happening, which is fun to be able to see, thank goodness. And I think it's great the way these various men's groups in the towns of Connecticut share with each other, because I've spoken in other towns too. And I'm happy to be part of, your distinguished roster of speakers. As Joe mentioned, this is my book, The Last At-Bat of Shoeless Joe. So I'll be sort of reading from as best I can on Zoom from my talk, and then opening the book and reading from the book from time to time. And of course, there's some questions at the end. That's good. As mentioned, much of my writing career has been about dramatizing history to bring it to life. I've written a musical about the Battle of Gettysburg called Battle Cry. I wrote a musical based on Pat Conroy's novel, The Water is Wide, called Conrack. I'm currently have written a musical about Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln called Common Ground, which was going along nicely in its development path until COVID sort of sidetracked it, hopefully just for a while. But basically what I try to do is add a personal touch of what happened to the characters and discuss what they feel about what happened. So it's sort of quite natural that I would move to Shoeless Joe Jackson, especially as Joe mentioned that he's from my hometown of Greenville, South Carolina. Now, exactly why Shoeless though? When I was growing up in the 50s, I played Little League Baseball for the Lions Club, but I never heard of Shoeless Joe Jackson, who died in 1951, but had lived right across town, and you would think might have been the topic of some conversation. But the reason he wasn't was that he was a cheater, someone who had deliberately thrown the World Series of 1919, it was alleged, by making a deal with gamblers. We'll give you money if you pay to lose. So he was persona non grata in my hometown, and certainly not someone to hold up as a role model for young men. I eventually learned about Shoeless, but what motivated me more was the more I read about what happened to him, the more outraged I became. I've always been drawn to stories of injustice. I grew up, after all, in the days of segregation in Greenville, and there was injustice aplenty to stir the soul. And it made me angry what happened to Shoeless and to other recipients of injustice, as you might say. So anger is a great motivator for creativity. So creative I became in the cause of Shoeless Joe. Who is this man nicknamed Shoeless Joe Jackson? He was born Joseph Jefferson Walford Jackson on July 16, 1887 in Pickens County, South Carolina. His father was a sharecropper, and starting at the age of 6 or 7, Joe went to work in one of Greenville's textile mills. It is hard to imagine the hardship of working in a textile mill. Joe had 12-hour shifts as a 7-year-old. For research, I once went into a mill. They gave me protective earphones to wear, and the noise was still the most intense sound I've ever heard. Something akin, I assume, to standing near a jet engine when it's taking off. And Joe, of course, didn't have protective earphones. A worker got 2 10-minute shifts and 1 20-minute shift in the whole break, in the whole workday. And in Joe's day, and also in the time of my novel, imagine all the lint in the air before they figured out how to deal with it. Here is how I tried to imagine it. Jimmy is the 17-year-old hero of my novel, a ball player with the talent to make it to the big leagues if only he could get Shoeless Joe to coach him. Thelma Roberts is Jimmy's mom. Let's see here. Thelma Roberts, excuse me. Thelma Roberts paused briefly from her job watching 24 mechanical looms weave yarn into cloth. She had time for a quick mop of her brow before returning to her vigil. If any one of the hundreds of threads on each loom broke, as often happened, she had to retie the ends with a weaver's knot. It took delicate fingers to draw the threads through the looms and quick ones to tie the knot before too much thread could spill onto the floor. A counter on top of each loom counted the picks, the number of times the loom's warp threads shifted and the shuttle flew across. Since she was paid by the pick, Thelma was diligent in monitoring the looms. Even with the inside temperature at 100 degrees, Thelma actually preferred days with high humidity like today. It kept the threads moist. Dry threads tended to break more easily, and a break in the thread could happen at any moment and meant less pay. By the end of her shift, her clothes would be completely soaked, her feet would ache from standing on trembling floorboards for 8 hours straight, and her ears would be ringing from the incessant screeching and clacking of 100 looms. The noise was so deafening that supervisors used a series of blinking lights to communicate things like the end of a shift, a fire drill, or anything else workers needed to know at the same time. In the weaving room where Thelma worked, yarn was dipped into a bath of hot starch and oil, dried over steam-heated drums, and wound onto a giant spool. Drawing-in girls laced each thread through individual eyes in the loom harness. Once drawing in was completed, weavers put the beam and harness on the loom and the weaving process began. At the end, women in the finishing room inspected the cloth for defects, then other women folded the textiles for shipping. Inside the mill, cotton lint floated everywhere, covering everything in the cavernous room. Man, woman, floor, clock, like fine snow. It was worse in the spinning room where Thelma had previously worked. She'd coughed a lot in those days. It was not uncommon for mill workers to vomit balls of cotton. As I said, life in a textile mill was incredibly hard and not very healthy. And it could be dangerous. One worker reminisced, "I'd get my apron tore off me in the speeder room. They'd wind me up and I was just lucky I managed to stop them and get my arms in them. I know one lady said she wore wigs and she'd get her hair caught and it pulled her whole scalp out, every bit of her hair." But there's also a great sense of community. Like a family is a popular way of describing mill life. People knew each other from kid up, often married within the village. Where else would you meet anyone? Music was a great way to relax. People would often have impromptu sing-alongs, or someone would have a dance in their house. Just take out all the beds and dance away. Neighbors visited each other every night. The church was a hugely important part of everybody's life. And Sunday was the one day mill owners closed the mill. Lint head is a derogatory name for mill people. But one worker said she'd rather be called a lint head than not. We're willing to work for what we get. We ain't looking for something for nothing. We're trying to make our own way. I don't see a thing wrong with working in a cotton mill. And there was baseball. Owners quickly realized that this sport was a good way of making workers forget about their drudgery. So they organized the Textile Baseball League. And local mills would shut down on Saturday afternoons in the summer and play each other. The Textile Baseball League was what major league teams used to scout for talent before minor league teams came along. And this is where young Joe Jackson began his journey to the big leagues. At the age of 13 in 1900, Joe started to play for Brandon Mill at $2.50 a Saturday, equal to about $80 today. The owners paid good money for ball players. It was a great way to supplement your salary. Like many, Joe started out as a pitcher, but he threw so hard he broke a batter's arm, so no one would bat against him, and he moved to the left field. It was in his mill playing days that Shoeless Joe got his name. Here's how I describe it. It ain't much of a story, Joe began, and Katie, his wife, smiled and sat back. I'd bought myself some new spikes in, what year was it, Katie? 1908, Joe. In a game against the Anderson Electricians. A long time ago, Joe mused. Ain't it funny how some things just stick to you? He swirled the lemonade in his glass around a few times. Anyway, them spikes were killing me during the game. I hadn't had time to break them in, so I just took them off when I came up to bat. Turns out I hit one pretty deep to right, and I was trying to stretch it into an inside the Parker, and some fan yelled at me as I was rounding third, "Run, you shoeless son of a bitch!" Jimmy laughed. That's how it happened. Well, Scoop Latimer of the News picked it up in the paper, and the next day, that helped it stick. It's a great nickname, Jimmy said enthusiastically. Joe's face darkened. Isn't it? Joe doesn't like it, Katie said. Why not? Katie looked at Joe. He was the one to explain. Everybody thinks I got that name because I was too poor to buy shoes or too dumb to wear them. Either way, it don't reflect good on me. Jimmy was shocked. He'd always loved the name. Joe's face hardened. I've made Katie promise they won't put that on my tombstone. You make sure she keeps it, he said to Jimmy. No need to, Joe. I know how you feel about it, Katie said slowly. And if she goes first, I'm counting on you, Jimmy, Joe said. Yes, sir, Jimmy bowed solemnly. I won't let it be on your tombstone if I can help it. And in Memorial Cemetery in Greenville, South Carolina, where Joe is buried, it does not say Shoeless Joe Jackson. Besides his nickname, Joe was also famous for his bat, under which he carved the name Black Betsy. It was made by a local fan, Charlie Ferguson, for a 4x4 beam from the north side of a hickory tree. Most bats were made from oak, but hickory is stronger. It was 36 inches long and weighed a hefty 48 ounces. For comparison, Ty Cobb's bat weighed 39 ounces. Ferguson rubbed it with tobacco juice, which blackened it. Joe had an intimate relationship with Black Betsy. Like many ball players, he had his superstitions. If he ever found a bobby pin, for example, he would pick it up and keep it in his baseball uniform pocket. With Black Betsy, he often slept with her, and he would talk to her, and he carried her around wrapped in cloth. He also took her home with him for the winter, so he didn't want her to get cold in those northern winters. In 1908, Joe signed with Connie Mack of the Philadelphia Athletics, but he didn't take to Major League Baseball right away. Joe had never learned to read or write. He had Katie sign his contracts, and he carried a slip of paper in his pocket which read, Best regards, Joe Jackson, which he would carefully copy out when asked for an autograph. At restaurants, he just ordered what he heard his teammates order. By the way, since Joe hardly ever signed his name, anything with his signature on it is worth a fair amount of money. The only known photograph signed by him fetched $100,000 a few years ago, and a baseball bearing his shaky signature sold for $78,000 in 2011. So this is what happened on Joe's first trip to the major leagues. He is having dinner with his teammates. Joe had innocently asked why there was water in the small bowl in front of his plate. Frankie, a well-built Italian from Philadelphia and a local hero, had told him it was drinking water. Why don't you put it in a glass? Joe asked. It's special water, Frankie replied. Comes from the mountains of Pennsylvania. It's kind of rare. Hotel saves it just for us. Try it. You'll like it. Some folks claim it improves your sex life, George Harding volunteered. What's that called, Professor? He looked towards Larry King, whom everybody considered the smartest man on the team because he'd gone to college. An aphrodisiac, Larry answered. Can you say aphrodisiac, Joe? George asked. Aphrodisiac? Close enough. George's riposte brought gales of laughter from the other teammates. Excuse me. Come on, Jackson, drink up, Frankie urged. It'll do you good. Joe was no different from any other rookie. He wanted to be liked. He wanted to fit in. He wanted to be part of the team. He lifted the bowl somewhat awkwardly, placed it to his lips, and took a swallow. If the laughter had been loud before, now it was raucous. That's a finger bowl, you dumb rube, Frankie cried between laughs. You clean your fingers in it. How was it, Jackson? Another player asked. Sweaty? Here, Joe, have some of mine, someone else offered. Mine too, another player shouted, holding up his finger bowl. For your sex life, a third player chimed in. By that time, Joe had risen red-faced from his chair and was walking out of the dining room. The taunts continued behind him, but he was determined not to hear them. He was determined never to hear these so-called teammates again, because Joe was different from most rookies. He didn't need baseball. The next morning, without a word, he got on a train and went back to Greenville. Excuse me. Joe actually twice went back home because of the dumb yokel needling of his teammates. But he eventually made it back and wound up playing his rookie season for the Cleveland Naps, which the Indians were originally named. His .408 average is still the record for a rookie and was second behind Ty Cobb in that year of 1911. The following season, he batted .395 and led the American League in hits, triples, and total bases. And the next year, he led the league with 197 hits and a .551 slugging average. In 1915, he was traded to the Chicago White Sox. 2 years later, he helped them win the World Series, hitting .307. The man could hit a baseball. It's not surprising that the Sultan of SWAT, Babe Ruth, modeled his own swing on the powerful swing of Joe Jackson. And then came the World Series of 1919, Chicago White Sox versus Cincinnati Reds. There's a lot of controversy about the facts of the Black Sox scandal and a lot of myths surrounding it. One myth right off the bat, excuse the pun, is that it wasn't called the Black Sox scandal because it was a dirty series. They were named the Black Sox a year before because their owner, Charles Comiskey, was so cheap he wouldn't wash their uniforms after every game. Comiskey himself is quite a controversial figure, so much so that some people think he should be taken out of the Hall of Fame and certainly should not have had a ballpark named after him. Here is somewhat of a timeline. The White Sox lose the 1919 World Series amidst rumors of a fix. Comiskey knows about the fix from Joe himself, as you will see, and he hires private investigators who gets the goods on several of the players. Nevertheless, Comiskey re-signs 7 of the 8 accused players the next January for his 1920 team. He also offers a $10,000 reward for information on the fix, all the while denying the rumors about it. The Chicago White Sox are in a 3-way tie for first place in the 1920 season when a small-time gambler, Bill Mayhard, tells his story to a reporter and names the 8 players, Shoeless included. Now, Comiskey can no longer deny the rumors, so he switches gears and suspends the 8 players, spinning his story that the headlines read, Comiskey hard hit by perfidy of his players, shock so great, friends fear for his health. A grand jury is summoned to investigate, but if Shoeless tells the truth, it will be obvious that Comiskey has lied to the public. So when Joe goes to Comiskey for advice on what to say to the grand jury, Comiskey isn't there, but Alfred Austrian, the White Sox lawyer, is. What he doesn't bother to tell Joe is that he is also Comiskey's personal lawyer. He also doesn't bother to tell him the paper he gets Joe to sign is a waiver of immunity from prosecution. Here's part of the scene I wrote. Austrian is speaking. Chick Gandil is the first baseman who masterminded the plot. Austrian speaking. Joe, you can tell your version of the grand jury and see if they buy it. I don't, and I don't think they will either. But you can take your chances. If they don't and it goes to the trial, you can see if a jury buys it. Or you can try another approach, one I would recommend. What's that? Admit it and say you're sorry. Joe had been slouched in his chair, but now he sat upright. Lie? It's your best chance, Joe. You know how forgiving the American people are. They just want sinners to say they're sorry. You think they want you out of baseball? You're Shoeless Joe Jackson, for God's sake. Their fans loved you. They'll forgive you for one little mistake. Mistake? Joe tried out the idea. Taking the money to Savannah had been a mistake, but that was his only one. Now Austrian wanted to say he'd made another by cheating. And what about this, Joe? Austrian continued. What about the gamblers? They think you were in on it. And then you tell the world you weren't, that you played your heart out to win. They might take that as a double cross. And gamblers don't exactly have a reputation for forgiving. Joe remembered what Lefty had said about protecting his family. He thought about Katie. He certainly did not want to put her at risk. But what would she say when she found out he'd lied to the grand jury? Why wasn't Katie here now so he could ask her? He needed someone he could trust. As if sensing his thoughts, Austrian said, Joe, I'm the lawyer for the Chicago White Sox. Would I want to give you bad advice? Does that mean you're my lawyer too? I'm the team's lawyer, Austrian said evasively. He didn't mention that he'd been a friend of Charles Comiskey for 20 years. I don't know, Mr. Austrian. I'm confused. That's it, Austrian suddenly shouted. What? The linchpin of your story. Austrian rose and began pacing as he spoke. We blame it all on Gandil. I mean, you do. Tell them he talked you into it, then double-crossed you over the money. Promised you 20 grand, only forked over 5. You were taken in, deceived, confused, like you said. Give them the dumb yokel act. Tell them you didn't know what the hell you were doing. The dumb yokel act. Joe hated it. Yet it was true. That is what a lot of people thought about him. Joe tried out the idea to himself. Poor boy from South Carolina taken in by Northern Sharpies. Say how sorry he was. Say he just wanted to play baseball. That's all he'd ever wanted to do. Beg the jurors to just let him play ball. You really think it'll work? Positive, Austrian replied. Now go down to that grand jury room and tell them what we've agreed on. Be humble. Be sorry. Put in a good word for Mr. Comiskey. Tell him what a great boss he's been. How ashamed you feel in front of your wife. And so sorry to have let down such an honorable man. Tell him you just want to play ball for the good people of Chicago. Bring a World Series championship back to this great town. They deserve it. He picked up a piece of paper from his desk and held it out to Joe. One other thing. What's that? Nothing. Just a legal matter you need to sign before you testify. What's it say? Well, you can read it if you like, Austrian answered, knowing Joe couldn't. I can't read, Mr. Austrian, Joe answered humbly. Well, then, I guess you'll have to trust me, huh, Joe? Think you can trust the lawyer for your baseball team, he said lightly. Can I take it to Katie to read? No time, Joe. Who knows when Eddie will be finished testifying? They could call you any minute. Austrian took a gold fountain pen from its holder on the desk and handed it to Joe and pointed to where he wished him to sign the paper. Joe took the pen and painstakingly drew the letters of his name, the only words he knew how to write. So, Joe's grand jury testimony is complicated. Of course, he's trying to tell two stories. Austrian's, I cheated, and his own, I played my heart out. It's also clear that Joe was drunk when he testified, and some think Austrian got him drunk. It wasn't hard for me as a novelist and simply as a human being to feel sorry for this uneducated country boy going before a grand jury accused of cheating in the big time city of Chicago. Sorry. Not surprisingly, Joe and the others were indicted and the trial date was set. But just what was Joe's story? There's no doubt about his play. He had 12 base hits, a World Series record that stood until 1964. He led both teams with a .375 average, made no errors, threw out a runner at the plate, and hit the only home run. So how did he become involved in the scandal? Because Chick Gandil simply told the gamblers that Joe was in on it to shore up his side of the bet, show them the star of the team was in on the fix. Really, the only incriminating evidence against Joe, I believe, was the $5,000 he received from Lefty Williams, who definitely was in on the pitch. Joe had gone to the manager, Kid Gleason, and asked to bench him because Joe knew about the fix and wanted to make sure he wasn't accused of being in on it. But Gleason, instructed by Comiskey, refused. Joe did try to see Comiskey, but Comiskey wouldn't talk to him. He tried to give Comiskey the $5,000 back, but he wouldn't take it. So Joe took it home to Savannah and put it in a bank. He claims he only used it to pay the medical bills of his sister because he really didn't believe the money was his. To me, keeping the money is the only evidence I believe might be credible if one believes Joe cheated. But knowing what I've read about him, about the scandal, and about the man, I don't believe it. I think Joe Jackson was a good Christian man, a humble man who loved baseball, an honest man who would never dream of cheating. As he wrote, God knows I gave my best in baseball, and no one can truthfully judge me otherwise. And you know what? Two juries agreed with me. What people forget is that a jury declared the 8 ball players innocent on August 2nd, 1921, after less than 3 hours of deliberation. And here's one of the big reasons why. Somehow, all of the confessions of the players and some of the other evidence gathered by the grand jury disappeared before the trial. That's right. When the new state's attorney went to look for it in December 1920, it was nowhere to be found. I wonder if it would have helped Charles Comiskey for the confessions of his players to go missing. Most sources think he teamed up with gambler Abe Rothstein to make that happen. None of the players testified at the trial, and the prosecution's witnesses consisted only of 2 gamblers. Also, there was no Illinois law against fixing or throwing games. The fraud charges proved too difficult to prove, and the players all retired to a nearby restaurant to celebrate. I'm sure Charles Comiskey celebrated too. Their celebration did not last long. The very next morning, the new commissioner of baseball, Judge Kennesaw Mountain Landis, issued this edict. Regardless of the verdict of juries, no player who throws a ball game, no player that undertakes or promises to throw a ball game, no player that sits in conference with a bunch of crooked players and gamblers where the ways and means of throwing games are discussed and does not promptly tell his club about it will ever play professional baseball. Don't you love that phrase, regardless of the verdict of juries? Imagine applying that to any other segment of our society, supposedly ruled by law. I also admire the elegant language of a bunch of crooked players and gamblers. But Landis wasn't concerned with eloquence. He was concerned with cleaning up the image of baseball, which had begun to be tarnished by all the gambling that went along with the game. He was charged by the owners who appointed him with safeguarding their investments. The best way to make sure the fans kept coming was to make sure there wasn't a hint of anything inappropriate or underhanded in the playing of the game. Joe was never in any of the meetings where the fix was discussed. Too bad. Joe tried to tell Comiskey about the fix. He never made it past the office door. Joe tried to return the money. Prove it. So Shoeless Joe Jackson, despite the verdict of the jury, was banned from professional baseball on August 3rd, 1921, and never played another professional game. I spoke earlier of the verdict of two juries. In 1924, Joe sued Charles Comiskey for fraud, saying when he signed a 3-year contract before the 1920 season, Comiskey's team secretary, Harry Grabiner, lied to him and said they had waived the standard 10-day clause in Joe's contract. This clause allowed a team to terminate a player with 10 days notice, which is what Comiskey had used to originally fire Joe. For Comiskey to prevail in court, he had to convince the jury that since Joe had been declared innocent in 1920, he was in fact guilty. They couldn't do it. 11 out of 12 jurors believed Joe Jackson and awarded him some $16,000 in back pay. Unfortunately, Judge John J. Gregory agreed with the lone juror and set aside the verdict. Also, Joe's testimony in 1920 was admitted in the 1924 trial. And in the latter trial, there was no story Joe could tell that wouldn't be contradicted by his earlier confused testimony. Result, the judge said Joe had committed perjury and threw him in jail. That's right, after refusing to participate in the fix, after winning the verdict of two juries, Joe found himself in jail. Fortunately, if there's anything fortunate in Shoeless Joe Jackson's trials and tribulations, he was able to make bail after only a few hours. There's only one other myth I'd like to talk about, the one practically everybody knows. It involves the saying, "Say it ain't so, Joe." It was created by sports writer Hugh Fullerton and appeared in the New York Evening World on September 30th, 1920. I'll read from it because it is a bravura performance of purple prose. There came a day when a crook spread money before this ignorant idol, and he fell. For a few dollars, which perhaps seemed a fortune to him, he sold his honor. And when the inevitable came, when the truth stood revealed, Joe Jackson went before a body of men and told the story of his own infamy. While he related the sordid details to the stern-faced, shocked men, there gathered outside the big stone building a group of boys. Their faces were serious, more serious than those who listened inside to the shame of the nation's sport. There was no shouting, no scuffling. They did not talk of baseball or of anything else. A great fear and a great hope fought for mastery within each kid's heart. It couldn't be true. After an hour, a man, guarded like a felon by other men, emerged from the door. He did not swagger. He slunk along between his guardians, and the kids, with wide eyes and tightened throats, watched, and one, bolder than the others, pressed forward and said, "It ain't so, Joe, is it?" Jackson gulped back a sob. The shame of utter shame flushed his brown face. He choked an instant. "Yes, kid, I'm afraid it is." And the world of faith crashed around the heads of the kids. Their idol lay in dust, their faith destroyed. Nothing was true, nothing was honest. There was no Santa Claus. Then, and not until then, did Jackson, hurrying away to escape the sight of the faces of the kids, understand the enormity of the thing he had done. Interesting, from all that I have read, nowhere is the exact phrase, "Say it ain't so, Joe," recorded. Since it's a novel about baseball, I would like to close by reading.
You went mute.
You hit that by mistake. Sorry. Thank you. Let's see. So it's also, by the way, my novel is really about Jimmy and his girlfriend Rhoda, and the final championship game between the two textile mills. One of them, who's owned by a Northerner, and who wants to get the heck out of the South. And if he can win the championship, he knows a way to do it. Anyway, the baseball game scene. Prior to this, we've seen Joe coaching from the dugout, innocently peeling a potato. The game is tied with runners on second and third when Shoeless calls his catcher, Petey, over for a chat. Frankie is the umpire. Joe draped his arm around his catcher and talked earnestly in his ear, walking both of them away from home plate. Then Shoeless slapped Petey's mitt and turned back to the dugout. Petey resumed his place, squatting behind home plate and signaling Murphy for the next pitch. When it came, a fastball outside, Petey rose up, grabbed the pitch, and immediately threw towards third base, attempting to catch the runner napping. The ball sailed over Bill White's head into left field, and both runners took off running. But a baseball wasn't what had sailed over Whitey's head. The baseball rested in Petey's right hand as he calmly stepped in front of home plate and tagged out the runner from third, then threw down to Whitey, who tagged out the runner coming from second. 2 outs, double play, end of inning, game still tied. The stadium erupted. Players from the Woodside poured onto the field, most of them running right at the umpire. "What the hell is going on?" screamed Rusty Peters, the Woodside manager. "Don't know, Rusty," Frankie said calmly. "Your boys started running. Petey tagged them out." "With what?" shouted Rusty. "With this." Frankie held up the baseball Bill White had tossed him at the end of the inning. "What in tarnation did Petey throw in the left field then?" Rusty asked. "This," said one of his players and handed Rusty the object he'd run into the outfield and retrieved. "A potato?" shouted Rusty. "What's Petey doing with a potato in his glove?" Several Woodfight players shouted at Frankie. "Come on, Ump, that ain't baseball. That ain't fair. That's crazy, Ump. Don't let him cheat, Frankie." Frankie ignored everyone. "Maybe Petey thought he'd get hungry," he said to Rusty, turning away. "This ain't funny, Frankie." Rusty ran in front of him, blocking his way. "You can't throw a potato onto a ball field." "I'm not sure there's a rule about that, Rusty," Frankie said, his voice beginning to rise in anger. "There sure as hell ought to be. Jackson's behind this, I guarantee you. You ought to throw him out of the game. Throw him out, throw him out, throw him out." "I'm going to throw you out if you don't get out of my way and get back to playing baseball," Frankie threatened. "Me? I ain't the cheating one." Frankie was soon encircled by an angry, swelling mob. He knew from experience that dangerous situations arose from time to time in textile ball. The fans were passionate, and there were no guards or fences to keep them off the field. A lot of pent-up frustration from their life-sapping jobs could easily translate into violence. He had umpired a long time and knew the situation called for action, so he took it. The kind of action umps in professional ball weren't allowed to take, but then this wasn't professional baseball. Frankie reached into his umpire jacket, pulled out a .45 caliber pistol, and fired it 3 times. "Listen," he said, "there ain't nothing says a player can't throw a potato in the field. The inning's over." He looked at the fans and waved his guns. "Y'all get your butts back in your seats." Howard Stone in the stands was apoplectic. "Was that the potato I saw Jackson peeling?" he shouted at Toby, the other owner. "Looks like it," Tony answered, trying not to smile too much. "This horse shit league," Howard shouted again. "You call this baseball?" "Textile style," Toby responded, "but it's still 9 men to a team and 27 outs, same as everywhere else." "It is not the same as everywhere else, Toby. Not by a long shot. Everywhere else, potatoes aren't baseballs." Shoeless Joe Jackson never played another professional baseball game when he was suspended near the end of the 1920 season. He retired to Savannah, where he ran a laundry, and then moved back to Greenville, where he ran a liquor store until his death on December 5th, 1951. It is that summer that I pick up the story of his story in my novel. I am happy to say that my hometown has now embraced Shoeless Joe. There's a statue of him, once in downtown Greenville and now moved opposite to the entrance of the minor league baseball team. The museum, they have created a Shoeless Joe Jackson museum, which is in his actual home, pretty much furnished the way it was. I have sat in his favorite chair and imagined him sitting there, perhaps thinking back to his days in the textile mill or on the textile baseball team and in the major leagues. I like to think he didn't dwell too much on the terrible injustice done to him, knowing surely someday one boy who grew up loving baseball just the way he did, perhaps a boy from his very hometown, would take up his cause and write a novel about it, celebrating him, his glorious achievements, and honoring his well-deserved place in the history of the great game of baseball. Thank you.
Thank you, Granville, for a very informative and entertaining presentation about Shoeless Joe Jackson and baseball the way it was in the small towns and in the majors back in the early days. So we're going to open it up to any questions that anybody may have. One thing that relating to Jackson's story in modern baseball, I think we had another great baseball player faced with the gambling situation, and of course it's Pete Rose. How do you relate the two situations, and can you?
Well, my take on Rose is that, there are these signs posted in the clubhouses about betting on games, et cetera. So I guess I basically think that he knew what he was doing and Shoeless Joe didn't. I mean, if I could break it down that simply. I think I'm conflicted, as probably most fans are. I mean, I'm a little clearer about the steroid era, which I just think really threw out, all the statistics and introduced all the asterisks and everything like that in terms of cheating. And the Houston Astros recently, it's interesting how people feel compelled to cheat in sports, especially baseball, it seems. But I think, again, that Shoeless Joe didn't know what he was doing. He really wasn't in on the fix, and he was innocent. And I do think Pete Rose was guilty. So if I would put Shoeless in and keep Rose out, I guess.
Thank you. Brian McDermott.
Yeah, I've got a question. That was a very good talk. Thank you very much. Is there any evidence that Joe Jackson played in other leagues other than the major leagues after he was restricted?
Yes, he would. he tried to do some barnstorming and play like in New Jersey. There are a couple examples of it, but the problem was that he was so darn good that people knew who he was immediately. He couldn't hide the fact that he was Shoeless Joe Jackson. So he played about maybe 3 or 4 other games, and then he had to give up.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Carl Shapiro.
Granville, that was really enjoyable and interesting. Question: how does this? Have you seen the film 8 Men Out, and how does that film compare to what your research has shown?
I have seen it. I think it pretty much makes Joe a little more complicit and guilty than mine does. I mean, I think there are arguments to be made on the other side. One of the more compelling ones, I guess, is that people have analyzed all the statistics and they say, well, he hit very poorly in the games they lost and he hit very well in the games they won. And that's why his average is so much higher, et cetera, or something. But my take on that is, I don't think you can choose when you hit a ball safely and when you don't hit it safely. It's very hard to believe that, okay, I'm going to hit well in this game and I'm not going to hit well in the other game. I can see not hitting well, but deciding to hit well, it's a little harder than that. But, I mean, I love that movie. I think it's great that it was written. And but anyway, I think that's my overall take, that he was a little more convinced of the guilt. I'd like to make a movie of my book where he comes off as innocent. So if you know any Hollywood producers out there, let me know.
You got to get a good agent.
I do need a good agent.
All right, guys, come on. I'm sure there are more baseball fans and questions out there. All right, Carl, again.
Granville, have you come across anybody presenting any other recent possible fixes in baseball that you've become aware of in your travels?
just the, you know, the Houston Astros last summer. Of,
Well,
you
the
know,
reason I ask is I remember watching with my father the the 68 World Series between the Cardinals and the Tigers, the Detroit Tigers. And every time I watch Eight Men Out, I think of that World Series because we watched the seventh game, and in that game, Kurt Flood lost a fly ball. Bob Gibson lost the game, which he was usually untouchable in the World Series. Lou Brock stole a base. And then, you know, you have Denny McClain, who later was arrested and convicted of racketeering. I always think of that. And then you look at the other issues that surfaced with the Kurt Flood later on going after the reserve clause in baseball, that you wonder maybe these guys, and I'm not accusing them, but he swears that it's fixed. He watched that game and he said, this isn't right. And he was a big baseball fan. And I just, when I watch Eight Men Out and I think of that World Series and the events that happened afterwards, where, you know, players were like, you know, couldn't be free agents and they were, you know, treated as property and they had no, you know, you had to play for that team or you couldn't do anything else. So that's why I raised that question.
no, that's certainly worth debating. I mean, that's a pretty good example. I mean, you know, Bob Gibson, you know, he could never lose. I mean, that year in particular, he had an amazing record. So I'd like to, I guess you could, what, do you find that game on YouTube or something? I haven't seen it.
Probably can't. It's just that,
but
to me,
yeah,
it was too many coincidences.
yeah, that's well put. Yeah, there are a lot of coincidences in that one, and certainly in the Shoeless Joe story, which makes it so controversial. Anyway, thanks for bringing that up.
Joe Raccanello.
Yes, good morning. Great presentation. I enjoyed it. I have been a baseball fan for years. And obviously this fellow was a great hitter. And I was kind of curious about the mechanics involved. And I suppose when you talk to people about being a good hitter, there are a lot of reasons why a person is a good hitter. In other words, can you talk a little bit about that and what your feeling was as to why he was such a great hitter? I mean, did he choke up on the bat? Did he stand deep in the batter's box? Did he study the pitcher? Or why do you think he was such a terrific hitter?
Well, one of the things that Joe did when he was growing up and first started playing ball, et cetera, and there are two things that I mention in my book, not mention, but make scenes out of. One of them, which struck me really strongly, and he uses these to teach Jimmy to be a better ball player, is he used to close one eye and stare at a candle. And then he would close the other eye and stare at it. I mean, for a long time, maybe an hour or more. I mean, in my novel, I'd say that, you know, Jimmy fell asleep doing it, and et cetera, et cetera. So that's one thing he claimed helped him really see pitches, really seeing things true. I call it my novel. And because it's a kind of a metaphor for the whole book in some way. So that was one thing he did, training himself. Another thing he did was he used to hold the bat out straight out from his arm for a very, very, very long time. I mean, if you've ever tried to hold a baseball bat, especially one as heavy as that one, without letting your arm drop for a long time, it will create a great deal of muscular mass that you can use in hitting the ball a long way. So those are the two things I know. I don't know enough about the baseball swing to comment intelligently on his stride or how he came to it. But so I would just rest with he could see the ball really well and he was very powerful. And then on top of that, for whatever it is, they just claim, you know, he's the greatest natural hitter ever. Something about the way his body was developed and the way he could see and the way he would stride just was so natural that he was able to connect really well.
You know, your candle story, one thing I heard at one point was good hitters don't really have a pronounced dominant eye. Both eyes are, you know, pretty close. I think, you know, the candle theory with one eye and the other eye either developed the non-dominant eye in theory. But that was one theory about how, you know, what makes hitters so, you know, above the other.
That's good. That makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. So, you know, that does make sense. So, Larry, unmute yourself.
2 points. One, I always thought that the ringleader of the fix was the pitcher Eddie Cicotte, or Cicotte, and not Galvin, the guy you mentioned in the book. Was it Cicotte? Wasn't Cicotte really the guy who arranged?
Well, I don't put myself out as an expert on this. I mean, I think both of those were highly involved, but I thought I had read that it was Chick Mandel who was actually, you know, the one who dealt with the gamblers and who came up with the idea and did the actual interface. I mean, I will yield to you on that, but my research, I thought, showed that it was Gandil.
Okay. Yeah, just from what I read, I always thought it was Cicotte.
I guess we'll have to go to Google right after this and figure out the answer.
Okay. As to the point Joe was talking about, what makes a great hitter, I think there's 2 things. I'm a baseball historian myself from ages ago. I think strong forearms and wrists from the physical point of view, and vision is really the key. I mean, the guy in modern times who's considered probably the best hitter is Ted Williams. And he certainly had extraordinary vision. In fact, he was a fighter pilot in the Air Force. Vision is really the key to seeing the spin on the ball and where it's headed. So that's my theory of what makes a good hitter.
Oh, well, those both fit in with Joe, I guess.
As far as wrists are concerned, I mean, Hank Aaron had the fastest wrists going, and he could just adjust so quickly.
Right.
So.
Another great hitter. You're right.
The guy to watch now is this DJ LeMahieu, who appears to be a great hitter anywhere, and you know, he's proven himself last year and this year. So I think you're going to see a lot more of him. Okay, any more questions for Granville? If not, I want to again thank you for a great presentation, and now we're all going to be looking at little things in these upcoming games, and to see who's not doing what they're used to doing, whether it's under pressure or not. But we've seen so many of these superstars going over in playoff and World Series games, and it makes you wonder how they can, I mean, sure, the pitching is different in playoff games, whatever, but you have to wonder sometimes why, you know, the guy gets a hit every third at bat and goes 20 at bats with not even touching the ball.
That is a good point. Yeah, I love it. No, thank you. I've really enjoyed doing this. If you want to read the novel, I think you might enjoy this mix of personal story with baseball history. I do flashback to everything that happened, as you heard.
Yeah, and maybe Dick Hopper, Dick. You might want to maybe consider that as one of the book club books. So you're muted, Dick, but yeah.
Hopefully you'll be surprised about what happens at his last at bat. So I'll leave it at that.
Okay.
Selfless self-promotion, I know. Shameless self-promotion, but no. I enjoyed writing the book a lot, especially since he's from my hometown, and doing all the research was really fun.
Yeah, I spent 9 months living in Greenville, you know, working out of Floor Daniels' office.
Oh my goodness. Our connector, I knew I don't know when that, were you around in the Buck Mickle days or not? No.
I was back
Danny
in
Construction
90, in the late 90s. So it was,
Oh, I see. Well,
I enjoy Greenville. Great little town.
oh my goodness, it has become an amazing town now.
Yeah.
One of the 10 best places to live in the country.
It was, I enjoyed living there for, like I say, I was there for 6 months, coming home every other weekend. So great town.
Many years it's become remarkably better in a lot of ways, reasons. No, that's great.
Okay, with that, guys, unless anybody has anything to add to the meeting, have a safe week, be careful, and we'll see